friends, I've got just Scarlett here to read the next 2 chapters of The World According to Humphrey. She's getting some alone time with our chapter book. The other 2 are in bed already, even though it's still light out. Okay, so we left off with the principal taking Humphrey home for the weekend, which is super nice of him. I bet Dr. Oliva would do that too. Okay, chapter 5 is called Plans Are Hatched. And remember, the principal's kids don't listen to him at home, and so he wants to teach them a lesson, and Humphrey thinks he has an idea. When Mr. Morales went into the kitchen to get a glass of water, I carefully opened the lock that doesn't lock and slipped out of my cage. I leaped over the chair, then scampered down to the floor and hid in the corner behind the long curtains. Mr. Morales returned and sat down again. The children were still thumping and bumping and were now screaming and screeching as well. "Say, Humphrey, maybe you need some water too," he said, and leaned toward my cage. Mr. Morales gasped when he saw that it was empty. "Humphrey, where did you go? Oh, I should have known you'd escape. I'd run away from those kids if I could too, but do me a favor, Humphrey, please come out." In a panic, he darted around the room. "The kids in room 26 will hate me if I lose you," he said. I felt sorry for Mr. Morales, so I scratched around a little. "There you are," he said, bending down to look at me. "Now let's get you back in your cage." Not quite yet, I thought. He reached down to pick me up, and I scampered forward, just a few inches past his hand. "Don't do this to me, Humphrey," he said. "Cooperate." But I wasn't doing anything to him. I was doing something for him. "Work with me," he said, but this time to himself. "Maybe, hey, that's it." He looked down at me. "With your help, Humphrey." Mr. Morales really swung into action then. He raced upstairs. The thumping and bumping stopped. When he raced back downstairs, Willie and Brenda were with him. "Close all the doors, Willie," he said. "But Dad," Willie whined. "Close them," his father repeated firmly. "Now." Willie closed all the doors. "You two scared poor Humphrey with your screaming and poking and thumping. We may never see him again," he told them. Brenda burst into tears. "Humphrey's dead," she sobbed. "No, Humphrey's too smart for that," Mr. Morales told her, "but he will run away if you two aren't nice to him." Right. You have to be pretty smart to be a principal. "Now, do you want to help me get Humphrey back?" "Yes," the children shouted. Mr. Morales explained the plan. He said the only way they'd get me back in my cage was if they worked together, and they could only work together if they listened to him, really listened. They were listening now, and they kept listening too, because he told them the most important thing they could do was to be quiet. So they were quiet. "I'm pretty sure he's still in the room. Our job is to lure him back into his cage," Mr. Morales whispered. He put my cage in the middle of the floor. Then he went to the kitchen and got a handful of sunflower seeds. Willie and Brenda helped him make a trail of seeds across the floor leading up to the cage. "Good," said Mr. Morales. "Now we have to be very, very quiet and wait for Humphrey to pick up the seeds. But if you say anything or even move, you might scare him." "We'll be quiet, Dad," said Willie. Brenda agreed. They all sat on the sofa. "Do you think it will work, Willie?" Willie whispered. "Of course," Brenda answered. "Dad's smart." "Well, he's not the only one." I waited for a while. After all, the Morales children needed all the practice staying quiet they could get. When Willie got restless, I started skittering along the floor. "I hear him," said Brenda. "Shh," said Willie. I waited a few more seconds, then scrambled out of the corner and grabbed the closest seed. I could hear loud gasps from the children, but I pretended not to notice. I scurried toward the second seed. This plan Mr. Morales and I came up with was tasty, tasty, tasty. I could almost feel 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me, but I ignored them. I grabbed up the 3rd and 4th seeds, hid them in my cheek pouch, then stopped right outside the open door of my cage. Inside, Mr. Morales had left a lovely pile of sunflower seeds. It was nice to be free, but my cage was home after all. Besides, until the day somebody fixes the lock that doesn't lock, I can get out whenever I want. The kids were still quiet, so I made a run for the cage. Mr. Morales quickly closed the door, and the children began to cheer. "We did it," said Brenda. "Dad's the smartest man in the world," said Willie. "Hey, you kids helped. When we cooperate and work together, we make a pretty good team," Mr. Morales told them. "Lo mejor," Willie agreed, "the best." Mr. Morales squatted down and winked at me. Of course, Henry helped too, I'll say. The rest of the weekend with the Morales family was fine. Sometimes the kids started interrupting their dad or mom, but Mr. Morales just reminded them that they could be polite if they tried. Willie and Brenda tried. Mrs. Morales sold a house. It turns out that selling other people's houses is her job. So they celebrated with pizza and ice cream. Brenda learned to hold me gently. Willie even cleaned the poo out of my cage, which I appreciated. Life is good, I thought, as Mr. Morales drove me back to school Monday morning. Then I remembered Mrs. Brisbane, and how she'd said I was a troublemaker and she was going to get rid of me. Humphrey, you are a true friend, said Mr. Morales as he carried my cage back to room 26. I'll never forget what you did for me. As soon as class started on Monday, Heidi's mom came into the classroom and explained to everyone about taking me home on weekends. How many of you would be interested? Mrs. Hopper asked. Every single hand in the classroom was raised. Every hand except one, Mrs. Brisbane's. Still, it was a pretty good week. I got a 90% on the vocabulary test. I'll bet Saya got 100%, but she still didn't raise her hand even though she'd promised. And Aldo talked more and more every night. On Tuesday night, he leaned in close and asked, Humphrey, don't you ever wish you had a girlfriend? Like most hamsters, I'm pretty much of a loner, so I really hadn't thought about it before. Not sure, I squeaked. I would like one, said Aldo, a real nice girlfriend. I felt so sorry for Aldo, I squeaked extra loud when he performed his broom balancing act for me. I was still thinking about him on Wednesday. After everyone had left, while there was still light coming in the window, I meandered outside the cage to help myself to any mealworms that Heidi might have left behind when she fed me earlier in the day. The table was covered with newspapers, and while I nibbled, I browsed the news. All of life was there on the pages of the newspaper. Births and deaths, lost pets, sad, 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 funny jokes, good news and bad news. Then there were the ads. There were so many stores, not just Petarama, but Shoesorama and Foodorama and Books Galore and Wide World of Tools. And there were other ads too. One in particular caught my eye that afternoon. It read, Work nights, lonely, want to meet others who work nights? The Moonlighters Club, for people who work at night. Meetings are held during the day on weekdays. Hikes and outings to restaurants, parks, plays, movies, and much more. There was a name and a phone number at the end. I could hardly believe it. This was exactly what Aldo needed. I could already see him smiling and happy, going to parks and plays with the Moonlighters Club. But how could I get Aldo to read this ad? He'd probably just throw it away. Still, if I cut it out and left it in a place where he couldn't miss it, well, maybe. Hamsters can't do scissors, but we have nifty teeth. It took me a while to nibble the whole ad out neatly, but I did a pretty good job. Then I stood the clipping up against my cage. Aldo couldn't help but see it if he looked at me, which he always did. That evening, I was more anxious than usual for Aldo to arrive. When he turned on the lights, I squeaked, hello, right away. Greetings to you, my little friend, said Aldo as he pushed his cart into the room. You sound like you have something on your mind. You bet, I tried to tell him. He ambled over to my cage and leaned down to look in. What's happening, Humphrey, he asked. I saw his eyes light on the scrap of newspaper. Hey, I can hardly see you. He reached out and pushed the clipping aside. Read it, I squeaked right out. Of course he didn't understand. He didn't even look at what the ad said. He just set it down next to the cage and leaned in closer. I was squeaking a blue streak. Look at it now. Calm down, Humphrey. I've got a treat for you, said Aldo. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny bit of carrot. Your pal Aldo would never forget you. My heart sank. You try to help a human and they don't even pay attention. But as you know, I don't give up easily. I squeaked happily while he balanced his broom on one finger as usual, but my mind was on the Moonlighters Club and how to get Aldo there. After he left, I scrambled out of my cage, picked up the newspaper clipping, and tucked it inside my notebook. Then I hid the notebook behind my mirror. If I didn't, somebody mean like Mrs. Brisbane might throw it away. I was still wondering what to do with it the next day when Mrs. Brisbane rolled in a cart with a big machine on it. This is the overhead projector, she told the class. I'm going to use it for some map work. When Mrs. Brisbane turned the machine on, a bright light was projected onto the wall. Then she placed a paper map on the glass, and suddenly that map showed up really big on the wall. She could write on it and draw on it, and you could see everything she wrote. A machine like this could come in very handy, I thought. So when Mrs. Brisbane turned the machine off and sent my classmates off to lunch, I thought about that machine. When AJ cleaned my cage and changed my water and bedding, I thought about that machine. I thought about it so hard, I suddenly came up with a really, really, really good plan. But it would be difficult to carry out and dangerous as well. Tip 5. If a hamster manages to escape his cage, you can sometimes lure him back in with a trail of sunflower seeds. Chapter 6. Moonlight Madness. I waited until the school day was completely quiet. No students, no teachers, no Mr. Morales. Then I got busy because I had a lot of work to do. Big work for a small hamster. First, I took the Moonlighters Club clipping out of my notebook. Holding it in my mouth, I opened the lock that doesn't lock and scurried across the table. Getting down off that table was still a problem. I grabbed hold of the leg and slid down as I've done before. It makes me feel a little queasy in my tummy, but it would be worthwhile if I could get Aldo some friends. I hurried over to the big machine, which was very, very high off the ground. It seemed impossible for me to get up there, but I had it all planned out in my mind. Crawl up the wastebasket. Ooh, I didn't know it would sway like that. Leap over to the seat of Mrs. Brisbane's chair. Whoa, slippery. Crawl up the rungs to the chalkboard tray behind it. Along the chalkboard tray to the bookcase. Then the hardest part, the dive from the bookcase to the overhead projector cart. If you ever try it yourself, don't look down. I was practically home free, but I still had to get up to the lit part. Still holding a newspaper clipping in my mouth, I grabbed onto a big screw sticking out of the side and pulled myself up. Then I reached up as high as I could, and I just barely managed to touch the top. Good thing I've got big muscles because I was able to pull myself up. I was there. It was like climbing Mount McKinley, the tallest mountain peak in the United States. Asked Mrs. Brisbane. I quickly pushed the switch. I wished I had some sunglasses because I was suddenly surrounded by blinding light. It was like being inside a light bulb. I took the newspaper clipping out of my mouth and carefully laid it on the flat glass. Then I looked up at the wall, and no, up on the screen was a picture of a car, and behind it there was jumbled up backward writing. I realized I must have laid the clipping on the glass upside down. I quickly turned it over, and there it was, all the information about the Moonlighters Club right there on the wall with the outline of the car behind it. Aldo would be coming soon, so I hurried back to the cage. It was faster getting back because it was mostly downhill until the very end, when I had to swing my way up the cord to the blinds and back to the table. I was panting pretty hard by the time I closed the cage door behind me. I didn't even have time to catch my breath before Aldo swung the door open. "Whoa, who left that on?" he exclaimed as he entered. "That thing could overheat." He hurried over to the overhead projector. "Look at the wall, look up at the wall," I squeaked, but the words only sounded like hamster peeps. Aldo didn't waste a second. He flicked the machine off. All that work for nothing. But then a funny thing happened. Aldo turned the machine back on and looked at the wall. "What's this?" he muttered. "Why did Mrs. Brisbane have this up here? Hey, nice car." He squinted up at the screen. "Look, Henry, the Moonlighters Club, for people who work at night like me." And me, I thought. I was still quite exhausted from all that effort. Aldo stared at the big ad on the wall for a while. Then he turned off the projector and went to work and never mentioned it again. Yes, I was annoyed. I had failed, but at least I had tried, which was more than I can say for one of my classmates. Yes, Saya Nasiri. With my own furry ears, I had heard her promise Mrs. Brisbane that she would raise her hand in class, but so far she'd been as silent as a statue. Her week was almost up. Even though I'd scolded her the day she fed me, she paid no more attention to me than she had to her teacher. You should really listen to your teacher, even Mrs. Brisbane, and you should always listen to your hamster. I was worried about Aldo and about Saya, but I have to admit, my journey had been so tiring that nocturnal or not, I slept soundly the rest of the night. The next day began in a very surprising way. "I have something to share with you all," Mrs. Brisbane announced. She held up a postcard with a picture of colorful parrots perched in lush green trees. A postcard from Miss McNamara. Mrs. Brisbane would never call her Miss Mac. It says, "Greetings to my favorite class in the world, room 26. I am now working in a school here in Brazil. This country is beautiful and friendly. I really enjoyed talking with the parrots in the rainforest. I miss you all, especially my pal Humphrey. Lots of love, Miss Mac." Mrs. Brisbane had to say Miss Mac since that's the way the card was signed. Happy, happy, happy. Not only did Miss Mac remember me, she missed me most of all. Oh, and I missed her most of all, too, especially every time I looked at Mrs. Brisbane and she glared back at me. Mrs. Brisbane showed us Brazil on the map, and it's far away. I'd like to be that far away from Mrs. Brisbane. My head was so filled with memories of Miss Mac that I only got 75% on my vocabulary test. After we graded the tests in class, Mrs. Brisbane said, "If you got 100% on the test, please raise your hand." That woke me up. What a clever way to get Saya to raise her hand, because she always got 100%. AJ raised his hand. Art raised his hand. Saya just stared down at her desktop. I was starting to get really mad at her. When it was time for map work, Mrs. Brisbane clicked on the overhead projector, and there it was, the Moonlighters Club ad right on the wall. Mrs. Brisbane wrinkled her nose, picked up the paper, and looked at both sides. Then she held it up to the light, and I think maybe she noticed those little tiny holes my teeth had made when I carried it over there. Mrs. Brisbane looked over at my cage and wrinkled her nose again. Then she crumpled the paper and threw it in the wastebasket. She's smart, but she's also mean. She's not the only one. While she went on with her map work, Wait for the Bell Garth Tugwell started making some very rude noises. Mrs. Brisbane didn't even turn around. When someone started giggling, she just said, "Stop giggling, Gail." So Garth's rude noises got louder and even ruder. And a lot of other kids giggled along with Gail. Suddenly, the teacher spun around to face them. "Very well, the whole class will stay in during recess for extra vocabulary words," she announced. Oh, everybody groaned. "It's Garth's fault," said Heidi. Raise your hand, Mrs. Brisbane snapped back. You will all stay in during recess, unless the person making those noises wants to step forward and admit it. Nobody said a word, but everybody glared at Garth, including me. Okay, I did it, he said. Raise your hand, Heidi whispered loudly. Very well, Garth. You, Heidi, and Gail will stay in during recess, the teacher said firmly. Heidi and Gail protested until the bell rang, but all three of them stayed in during recess. Instead of making them do extra vocabulary words, though, Mrs. Brisbane let them rest their heads on their desks, after she lectured them about their behavior, of course. All this commotion had made me a little hungry, and for some reason I hadn't been fed yet, so I decided to squeak up for myself. Mrs. Brisbane turned and pointed at me angrily. I don't need any trouble out of you either, she said. Heidi raised her hand. I don't think he's been fed today, she said. Mrs. Brisbane told Garth to feed me. Then she dismissed the girls and told them to go outside and play for the rest of recess. So she wasn't completely mean to them anyway. She even trusted Garth to be alone in the room while she took some papers down to the office. I'd always liked to wait for the bell, Garth, so I was surprised when he started grumbling at me as he filled the water bottle and put some fresh mealworms in my cage. One of these days you'll get in trouble too, he said. I'll see to that. Huh? I squeaked. Everybody hates me. Everybody loves you. You're just a rat in disguise. The words hurt me a lot. Why would Garth say that? I mean, sure, almost everybody does love me, but I don't make rude noises and get other people into trouble. I was still pondering Garth's behavior when my classmates returned to room 26. Mrs. Brisbane must have gotten rested up over the recess because she greeted them with a smile. I have a surprise for you, she told the kids. Surprises always get the class's attention. They think surprises are always good. However, I know that surprises can sometimes be bad, like the day Miss Mack left me forever. We're going to pick who gets to take Humphrey home for the weekend, she explained. Now you all know whether or not your parents gave permission for you to bring him home. So if you'd like Humphrey this weekend, raise your hand now. Hey, you should have seen all the hands that went up. I could hardly believe my eyes. Miranda and Heidi and AJ and every single hand in the class except Garth's. Even Saya Nasiri raised her hand. Mrs. Brisbane noticed. Saya, do you think it will be all right with your parents, she asked. Saya nodded her head. I can't hear you, said Mrs. Brisbane. Yes, ma'am, said Saya. It was strange to hear her voice in the classroom. Mrs. Brisbane gave her a note to bring back from her family on Friday. I napped the rest of the afternoon, but whenever I woke up and glanced over at Saya's desk, I saw her doing something I'd never seen before, smiling. Tip 6. You can leave your hamster alone for a day or two. Otherwise, find a suitable caretaker or, if possible, take your hamster with you. In its own cage, a hamster can be very portable. And that's the end of that chapter.